The latest entry in Capcom's survival horror series has arrived with Resident Evil Village. We've had a chance to preview the game previously thanks to various pre-release demos, but now we've played through the entire game and have had a chance to better process it. As a follow-up to Resident Evil 7, this new game takes place entirely in first person, but with some key improvements both to game design and overall technology. So for this video, we'll examine the gorgeous visuals on display in this game, discussing the finer details in the environment, the quality of the character rendering, and features such as ray tracing. We'll also take a look at the new generation of consoles and see how they fare in the final game. This means Xbox Series X, Series S, and PlayStation 5. So with that in mind, let us commence. Since the release of Resident Evil 7, Capcom has shifted most of its development efforts over to its new internal RE engine, and the result has been a selection of beautiful games targeting generally higher frame rates. In fact, aside from Monster Hunter Rise on the Nintendo Switch, every other RE engine game has been created with 60 frames per second in mind as the target, and Village is no exception. But RE7 is important as it was the first new RE engine game, and looking back we get a sense of how things have evolved since then. It still holds up well, but Village showcases a dramatic boost in overall scene complexity and scale. This is perhaps what stands out most to my eye then. Every scene feels so carefully pieced together in this beautiful marriage of art and technology. Yes, RE Engine powers the game, but it's the art team within Capcom that really steals the show. Every sequence is carefully crafted with an eye towards overall scene composition above all else. Let's examine a couple different areas then to better understand what I mean. For starters, this is a section within the village itself. From this position, there are multiple gates within view. Already, no matter which direction you point the camera, there's a sense that the scene composition is perfectly refined. The distant background lends the world a sense of scale. Midfield objects are then placed in a way to connect the background to the foreground, and that foreground then is packed with extremely fine detail. There's this sense that every surface is, as we say, bespoke. The textures exhibit so much variety that just sort of pulls you into the environment. The game does a wonderful job of delivering both an exceptional sense of scale, but also delivering near-field detail. Every angle of every frame feels carefully considered, which is quite a feat given the first-person exploratory nature of the game. This engine, of course, supports physically based rendering, and here too I feel the art team has made great use of its capabilities. The castle area is especially stunning with marble floors, realistic sculptures, and decorations all exhibiting authentic flourishes. This, combined with the ample geometry budget, gives the impression that we finally pushed beyond the pre-rendered backgrounds of the past. Now, that's not to say everything is perfect, mind you. One limitation with the scene variety stems from near-field surface detail. Press that camera up close against a surface, and the detail starts to break down a little. It feels like this is a result of the deeply layered approach to texturing the world. To avoid repetitive patterns, every surface feels distinct, but this variety does not seem to come free. That said, texture quality in general feels like a significant step up from Resident Evil 7. In that game, many surfaces break down when viewed from close proximity in a way that they thankfully don't in Village. In fact, while I highlighted a few examples here already, most of the assets in Village do hold up rather well. As a first-person game then, another key element here is body awareness, essentially how well the camera and virtual body work in tandem with one another. If the act of moving and shooting feels poor, the illusion can fall apart. In that sense, I really feel Capcom has done an excellent job here, from the gentle bobbing of the camera to the swaying of your pistol as you walk through the world. Basic movement looks and feels exceptionally good. Look down and you'll see your feet. The player shadow then is projected from this model, which you control. It's especially effective when standing within an area lit volumetrically. Speaking of which, lighting in general is used exceptionally well in this game. Outdoors, Capcom relies heavily on volumetric fog and lighting to great effect, while indoor areas feature a mix of direct and indirect lighting, setting the mood. The way light spills in through the windows, gently lighting each room, is extremely effective. But there is some variation here depending on whether ray tracing is enabled or not, something we'll look at shortly. The thing is, the time of day changes at fixed points throughout the game, but most of the time, the game world is supremely overcast. The mix of volumetrics, subtle indirect lighting, and physically based materials are critical to achieving a realistic, natural appearance during these moments, and Capcom nailed it. That said, once you actually start to dig into the game, there are a few things that stick out. Ambient animation is nice. It's used for things like trees, which sway gently in the breeze, torches, and streams of water, among other things. But the actual interactivity is generally kept to a minimum. That is, most of the breakable objects are designated as interactive, usually through some visual flourish. But if you just walk along, unloading on random barrels, pottery, or other objects, most of the time they won't react in any meaningful way. So in that sense, the game world can feel a little static, much like the pre-rendered backgrounds of the past. Now, due to the nature of the game and the fact that you will need to conserve ammo, it doesn't stick out that much, but it is something to consider. Now, of course, most of your time in this game is spent in first person, and Village is rich in characters with a wide range of cutscenes and interactive sequences, which brings us to our next point: character detail and animation. Firstly, while playing the game, most cutscenes take place from this first-person perspective. I'm a big fan of this type of cutscene direction where the player camera and limbs are part of the animation sequence. Actors within the scene all center around this player perspective, and it looks great. All this animation was seemingly captured using a performance capture setup where both facial and full body movement data, along with the voice, are captured and utilized to create each scene.
And has already proven too much for my daughters to handle. When I find him, I won't let you down. To hell with the ceremony!
But if you take a closer look at any of these individuals, you may be surprised by just how much detail is present. It's debatable as to whether it matches the superb Devil May Cry 5 in this area, but it certainly comes close. Thankfully, the game includes a model viewer which allows us to more closely examine each one. Every character features realistic skin, or the rotting flesh equivalent I suppose, combined with exceptional clothing detail. The material quality is realistic and natural, while the designs themselves are packed with tons of small details, including dangly bits that have their own physics applied to them. Village also features, dare I say, the highest quality rendering of a small child I've ever seen in a video game. Something very few games ever really get right. Well done, Capcom. Now, the enemies are certainly gruesome in this model viewer, but how do they actually behave in game? Well, I was relieved to discover that some of the tactics introduced in Resident Evil 4 are still useful here to a degree. Firing at your enemy's legs, for instance, will cause them to fall, slowing their progress. So location-specific attacks are still viable here, and the reactions are well animated, including the death animation, which is satisfying in a way that you would expect from the series. Now, this entry isn't quite as action-heavy as some of the third-person games, but there are plenty of combat-focused situations throughout, and they all look great in motion. Next up though, I'd like to discuss the game's ray tracing support. Only available on the latest generation of consoles and the PC, these options are toggled from the main menu, and Village is only the second RE engine title to receive real-time ray tracing as an option. Firstly, it should be noted that the performance while using ray tracing does seem to have been improved dramatically over Devil May Cry 5, but we'll get to that shortly. The point is, the cost here seems reasonable, and clearly Capcom has had more time to optimize the engine for this. So firstly, there's the ray traced reflections. You'll find reflective materials throughout Resident Evil Village, from shiny floors, to individual objects, to the surface of a large lake. All of these receive ray traced reflections. Unfortunately, the resolution of said reflections seems to be on the low side, perhaps as low as 1/8 resolution of the primary rendering res. As a result, while beneficial, especially in certain scenes, it's not really a game changer. In some areas, the ray-traced reflections can even look slightly less pleasing to the eye versus the rasterized ones, like in this cave here. On the other hand, it does offer another significant benefit: ray-traced occlusion shadows and lighting. We've long relied on a screen space solution which sort of darkens corners and edges to simulate contact shadows. Problem is, since it's done in screen space, you end up with these black outlines around objects that shouldn't be shadowed. So with ray tracing enabled, you can see that this is no longer the case. A tree sticking up out of the snow would not have such an obvious outline shadow around it. Yet in another scene, areas beneath the foliage are shadowed correctly with ray tracing enabled versus the standard screen space solution, where it's absent. Ray tracing also improves interior spaces with more natural local bounce lighting. It can appear subtle at first glance, but note the difference here. You can see a slight green hue due to the bounce lighting. That said, I do think they're using a rather cheap solution that's a step down from other RT implementations we've seen, but it is a nice touch, and it makes sense considering the higher resolution and frame rate target here. So yeah, the benefits of ray tracing are certainly numerous here, but whether or not you'd want to go for it will kind of depend upon the performance results, which we'll be getting to momentarily. So yes, Resident Evil Village is a gorgeous game. It sidesteps some of the visual faults from other more recent entries, such as the poor screen space reflection in RE2's remake, while offering up some of the most visually striking environments in series history. Not only that, it's completely seamless. The entire game world is fully connected. You can walk to and from various locations without any visible loading. I should note that the first hour or so of the game is extremely linear and cutscene heavy, but it does open up, so you'll see what I mean soon enough. But this brings us to the comparisons then. We've already covered the game's performance and image quality in the demo version, but many have been wondering how it fares in the final game. What is the cost of ray tracing? Well, before we talk about ray tracing, let's touch on the traditional rasterized version first. So when playing on Xbox Series X or the PlayStation 5, the final game is exactly as the demo suggests. It targets 3840 by 2160 using a form of checkerboard rendering. It should be stressed though that this implementation of checkerboarding is extremely robust and looks virtually identical to a full native 4K image. Only thin edges on hair or foliage reveal the underlying grid structure, so it looks great. But it performs even better. Both consoles in this mode deliver a 99.9% locked 60 frames per second experience. I say 99.9 only because the possibility for a drop can never be fully discounted, but after capturing most of the game in this mode, I did not find even a single frame rate drop. This is just a superbly fluid experience from start to finish, which is something I feel everyone should take a moment to appreciate. Yes, it's a cross-generation game, but it's rare to see what is essentially a perfect frame rate in a console game like this. It's really that good. Then we have Xbox Series S. This one targets 2560 by 1440 using the same reconstruction technique as its bigger brothers. While slightly softer, image quality is surprisingly good nonetheless, as is performance. I spent slightly less time playing the game on Series S, but after running through some of the game's heavier sequences, I found that it mostly holds 60 frames per second, but can occasionally exhibit dips such as this. Still, overall, it holds its own in this mode. The point is though, if you're playing the game without ray tracing, you're gonna have a great time on all three of the new generation consoles. With that established then, let's talk about ray tracing performance, starting with PlayStation 5 and Xbox Series X. Both versions retain the same reconstructed 2160p output, so image quality is unchanged. The ray tracing features themselves also appear identical between the two systems, but how well does it run? Well, in the demo version, Richard found that it ran roughly 10% faster on Xbox Series X in heavy sequences, but there's more to it than this. Having played a significant chunk of the game with ray tracing enabled on both machines, the truth is, both do a pretty good job of hitting the target 60 FPS. Capcom suggested that it's 4K 45 on these machines, but honestly the reality is rosier. At least overall, because I did find one area which pushes both of these machines hard, this lake sequence. The body of water here uses ray trace reflections. The scene itself is relatively complex, and there's this huge enemy hunting you throughout the stage, which can spawn a lot of alpha particles. As a result, performance definitely takes a hit. Based on testing this scene though, the performance differential between the two systems is roughly equivalent to what Richard noted in the demo preview. So basically, both versions perform generally well with ray tracing, but Xbox still has an advantage in the heavier sequences, such as this lake battle. Also worth noting that if you have a display capable of variable refresh rate, these drops in performance become virtually invisible to the eye. Hopefully we see this feature on PS5 soon enough, as it works very well on Xbox in this case. Well, I say that, but only if you're using the Xbox Series X, as VRR cannot save the Series S when using ray tracing. So as in regular mode, the Series S outputs 1440p with reconstruction, while RT features are in use. But the issue here is that the performance takes a significant tumble. Capcom noted 1440p 30 in its original chart, but the reality is that the frame rate is simply uncapped and wildly unstable. The fact that it drops below 40 FPS regularly and sometimes even below 30 means that VRR is not suitable in this case. It just looks poor in motion, thus I would recommend against using it unless you have a high tolerance for instability. This mode demands an optional 30 FPS cap to become useful, at least in my opinion. But of course, frame rate is not the only measurement of performance. Village also highlights a difference in the way loading is handled. On Xbox Series X or Series S, when you load up a save, return to the main menu, or begin a Mercenaries match, you're met with a relatively brief loading screen followed by an A prompt. It's a lot shorter than Resident Evil 7, but it is there. On PlayStation 5, however, loading screens have been eliminated entirely, replaced instead with this short dip to black. It is, for all intents and purposes, instant. You hit load and the game just begins. What's interesting here is that this has changed since the demo release, which did feature these loading screens, so it's now faster than it was before. My guess is that they're taking full advantage of the new storage APIs on PS5 to enable such quick loading, and it is very effective here. So basically, PS5 has faster loading times, and Xbox Series X has an edge in frame rate when using ray tracing. But honestly, aside from those differences, both versions are extremely close to one another. It's one of the closest calls we've seen yet, and it feels like Capcom has done a good job on both machines. Xbox Series S is generally pretty good too, at least when not using ray tracing. I would argue that the target resolution with RT enabled is simply too high for this console. I should also make mention of the controller, I suppose, as Village takes advantage of both the DualSense and the Xbox pad. On PS5, the tension of the triggers is adjusted per weapon with variable force required to pull the trigger. You'll feel it engage and disengage depending on what you're aiming at. There's also general rumble used during gameplay that feels pretty good, though not as robust as, say, Returnal or Astro's Playroom. Now on the Xbox, the rumble triggers are put to use as well, with a lot of strong per-trigger vibration communicating what's happening in the scene. In addition, the game's audio is well done. 3D audio is supported for headphone users and adjustable through the options menu, but in my case, I used the surround sound multi-channel mode during gameplay with my speaker setup. Positional audio is important in this game during some of the game's larger sequences, plus it adds a lot of needed tension when it needs to. Lastly, there's the HDR support. Capcom has retained the same baffling setup process as before, and following these instructions can lead to suboptimal results, but once configured correctly for your specific display, it looks fantastic. There's a strong contrast between bright highlights and darker interiors, and it works very well in this case. While we're on this topic though, I want to share one quick tip for owners of LG's CX/C10 OLED or the C1 OLED TVs. Village does not use camera rotation blur, right? And it benefits greatly from a low persistence display. So I suggest in this case enabling the LG Motion Pro or black frame insertion feature and selecting high. From there, it makes the image somewhat darker at 60 Hz, so this is why I would recommend using HDR in the game and setting your TV to use dynamic tone mapping. While it's slightly less accurate, it makes up for the overall brightness when using black frame insertion on high. Now, this isn't necessarily the most accurate image, but trust me, play it in a dark room with these settings and I think you'll be surprised at just how clean it looks in motion. Plus the extra bit of darkness you get from the BFI being enabled kind of works in this case. The only downside here is that VRR does not coexist with black frame insertion, so you're gonna have to pick. I also wanted to briefly share my thoughts on the game itself. Simply put, I enjoyed it a lot. The introduction sequence is a little long, mind you, with a lot of scripted sequences, but once you reach the castle, the game begins to unfold beautifully. Throughout the game, you'll visit multiple locations in and around the village that all offer a different sort of challenge, kind of like RE7 actually. But unlike RE7, the village itself serves as the glue between everything and helps give the impression of a larger world. As you complete each area, you will return to the village and find plenty of exploration and supplies to pick up along the way, not to mention some combat. And again, gameplay-wise, I do recommend disabling auto-aim while toying with the aiming settings in general. Once you dial it in, the combat starts to feel especially satisfying, though there isn't nearly as much actual combat in this as, say, Resident Evil 4, which there have been some comparisons to. There's a lot of great puzzles to solve as well in classic Resident Evil style, with a focus on bringing disparate items together to unlock the path forward. Technically, it's relatively simple, but it's satisfying making all these discoveries and slowly piecing together the map, so to speak. So yeah, I'm a fan of what they've achieved here, and am impressed with the sheer number of quality Resident Evil games Capcom has managed to deliver in recent years. I'm just glad that Village is one of those games. I'm also curious to see where the series goes next, but I'm sure we'll find out soon enough. But that's going to do it for this video, so if you enjoyed it, as always, be sure to let us know. Like, subscribe, ring the notification bell, follow us on Twitter, and all that good stuff. And until next time, this is John returning to the world of survival horror.